Well, here we are. There's an interesting story I want to talk about today. And a lot of you probably know it. If you've been collecting antiques or going to auctions for more than 25 years, you'll probably remember some of this story, if not all of it. And it's a fascinating one and was one of the greatest scandals to ever hit the auction market because it affected two of the two largest auction houses in the world, Christie's and Sotheby's. And it's a pretty amazing story because of the cast of characters involved in it. You had the managing director of Christie's, a man named Christopher Davidge. You had the chairman of Christie's involved, Sir Anthony Tennant. The owner of Sotheby's, now based in New York, of course, was at the time owned by a mall developer named Alfred Tubman, and he was the chairman. And he appointed a woman named Dee Dee Brooks to become the chief executive officer. And it's a real interesting cast of characters. They're very diverse. They go in every direction, and I'm going to go through some of it. But the first thing I want everybody to remember, the old adage, the first person to go to the prosecutor to make a deal usually gets the best deal. And there was never a case more obvious than this one. And if you know the story of the commission fixing scandal between Christie's and Sotheby's, I hope this fills in some of the blanks for you. Because it resulted in the fining and imprisonment of the Sotheby's chairman, a felony conviction and plea deal for the company's CEO, Dee Dee Brooks, and cost the companies combined around $500 million in settlements and class action suits, around $537 million actually, affecting 130,000 buyers and sellers who sued the companies once this story came out. And it all began, some say it all began in the mid-1980s with the Justice Department Antitrust Division, headed up by a man named John J. Green. And he was investigating bid rigging pools, or pools as they're called. And if you don't know about bid rigging or bid rings, it is an old practice that started in England several hundred years ago. I think the first pool that was ever done was done actually at Christie's, which is the older of the two firms. And it's a situation where if you've heard of pools or bid rings and you don't know how they work, I'll explain it to you real briefly. It's sort of a clever thing. It's completely illegal in every country. And how it works is this. If you go to an auction, and let's say hypothetically there is a painting that's worth $10,000. And most artwork like that, or a large percentage of it, is bought by dealers. And dealers are, of course, are always looking to get a good deal. So what happens? They all get together. If you pull together all of the dealers that are there that buy the painting, they all get together and they make an agreement that only one of them will bid in the auction. The rest of them will stand off to the side and not bid. And that'll suppress the price, theoretically, of how high the price of the item will go. And then once the item is sold, if the head of the pool or the head of this group, consortium, buy it, they pay the bill, and then they take it outside among the dealers themselves, and now they run a second auction. And now they find out what the picture's really worth, and everybody writes, usually down on a slip of paper, they'll write down how much they're willing to pay for it. And let's say that painting is worth $10,000, and finally somebody says, I'll pay $10,000 for it. He writes a check to $10,000. Let's say there are nine dealers in the pool. All right, they divide the money. They divide the $9,000 profit above and beyond what the auction house got paid for the painting. So they pay the auction house $1,000, then they resell it among themselves. And some of these dealers who never put up a dime each walk away with $1,000. Sometimes it's $10,000, depending on the amount of money involved. And some claim that is where this investigation got its first start, when Mr. Green realized that the antique and auction business is largely unregulated. And some claim there's two sources of how this investigation actually began for the bid rigging. Some claim it was at Christie's, following a Christie's arcade sale of a chest of drawers that sold for $30,000 in the room and then got knocked out afterwards among the dealers for around $38,000 or $40,000, something like that. And there's another theory that it began at the Skinner Auction House out in Bolton, Massachusetts, when one of the staffers found a catalog in the parking lot that had been discarded by a dealer who had been keeping record of who promised to pay what for the auctioned item once it was knocked out to them. In other words, it was basically a written record of how this one particular lot was pooled, and it had the names and initials next to each of the amounts. So it wasn't a hard thing for them to put together. And I remember that time because I remember the federal prosecutors were sweeping through New England interviewing auction houses, and at the time I was involved with one, and they wanted to know what we knew about it, and did we know any of the dealers involved. They mentioned a bunch of dealers. We, of course, knew them all because they were local dealers, but we didn't know anything about their activities in pools. That wasn't what we were there to do. But it was an interesting thing, and a number of people were convicted. Some people got big fines. Some people got house arrest. They had to wear ankle monitors and all kinds of things. All right. And that gave Mr. Green a taste of what might be going on in the auction business. And during that process, many say that some of the dealers that were being accused in New England and Vermont, New Hampshire, and here in Massachusetts said, well, what about Christie's and Sotheby's? What about the shenanigans that go on there? And apparently it got Mr. Green thinking, and he worked for the Justice Department in New York, and it started a multi-year investigation into the major auction houses, but it wasn't going anywhere. Nothing was really happening until they were notified by Christie's law firm that Christopher Davidge had turned over a bunch of papers to their legal department when he was leaving the firm. He was retiring. And he apparently had an argument or a fight with the owner of the company, Mr. Pinot, the Frenchman who bought the company in 1998. And he decided to quit and leave, and they were going to give him a severance package, which they gave him, about $10 million. And on the way out the door, he sent to the legal department that represented Christie's all of the documents to do with this price fixing thing. And it began with discussions between Mr. Tubman and Mr. Sir Anthony Tennant initially, where they were talking on the phone and going over the details of sort of a commission war that was going on between the two firms at the time. And they were sort of in a downward spiral. Prices kept getting cut and cut and cut and cut as each company were trying to get bigger parts of the auction market. And eventually they came to an agreement. And Mr. Tubman and Mr. Tennant contacted the people just below them, which would have been D.D. Brooks, who was the chairman, and Christopher Davidge, who was the managing director of Christie's, to work out the details, which they did. And they ended up implementing a basically fixed commission schedules, fixed sellers' commissions, and all this other stuff. And over the years, it, of course, cost consigners lots of money because they were no longer able to negotiate much in the way of commissions. And they ended up getting hit with massive amounts of lawsuits and class action lawsuits, which they were found completely guilty of all the way across the board. And it was all due to Mr. Davidge's wanting to get out of there because he knew that they would probably throw him under the bus if it ever came to light, if anything happened. And he had a bit, they claim, of a chip on his shoulder towards Christie's. And a bigger chip actually towards Sotheby's. He despised Sotheby's, and one of his missions when he took over the helm at Christie's was to try to do as much damage and hurt Sotheby's as he could. Now, he had an interesting background, Mr. Davidge did. He didn't come from the sort of upper echelons of British society that many of the people at Christie's typically did at the time. They brought in, Sir Anthony this and Lord that and all these people, and they had not been doing a good job of it. And Christopher Davidge had started out working at Christie's. His father had worked at Christie's, and his mother, I believe, who had sort of mid-range, mediocre jobs there, but they were never really allowed to be promoted much. They never went anywhere in the company, and they weren't treated very well, nor were they paid very well. Christopher was raised in public housing. So eventually, as he grew up, he ended up finally going to work for the printing company that was owned by Christie's that produced all of their auction catalogs. And he was asked to go in and try to straighten it out. They had a lot of cost overruns and issues. And he went in and he did a superb job running the printing shop. And it was noticed by management and said, this guy knows how to get stuff done, even though he was considered to be very rough around the edges and so forth and not an upper crust Brit. He didn't speak like an upper crust Brit. He didn't dress like an upper crust Brit. He was a little flashy and all that sort of thing. But he got the job done, and he moved up through the company quite well, and he ended up being appointed managing director over time. And once he got in there, he went on a very active campaign almost immediately to grab bigger slices of the auction market for Christie's and take it away from Sotheby's. And this is when the some of the war actually began between the two companies as far as commission rates go. And it continued for a number of years, and Christie's was getting bigger and bigger shares of the market, but their profits were going down. And he was rationalizing it, saying, well, once we get the bigger end of the market, then we can raise our commission rates back and earn more money. But right now we don't have the market. So it was all about this whole competitive push and pull between the two firms that was going on. And then around 1992, Mr. Tubman, who had bought Sotheby's in 1983, a few years earlier, was in a phone call with Anthony Tennant talking about this. And it was interesting because Tubman bought Sotheby's in 1983 when the company was in a huge amount of trouble financially, and he bought the whole company for just $34 million. That'll show you how much things have changed over the last 40 years or so. The company was down on its heels. They had fewer and fewer consignments. They weren't profitable, and there wasn't a lot of creative thinking going on. And Mr. Tubman bought the company, and he had a very good eye for spaces. He had a concept that he wanted to turn Sotheby's sort of into a shopping mall, not like a shopping mall, but a place where everybody could go to buy art. People could go to Sotheby's and buy. They would put in experts. And at that time, Sotheby's sort of crossed over the Rubicon, as they say, to become more of as much of a dealer, or like going to an art dealer, as they were being auctioneers. And it used to be both sides were very separate. You had the auction side and then you had the dealer side, and those two sides knew their positions. The dealers need the auction houses to buy inventory to make a profit, and the auction houses need the dealers to buy art to keep them profitable and to clear out estates and so forth. So it was a fairly good concept, and it worked for hundreds of years just fine. And Mr. Tubman came in and he realized that the only way to make Sotheby's more profitable was to make it more user-friendly among retail buyers, and that's what he did. And he redesigned the Sotheby's offices. He made them much more fluid. He got rid of a lot of dead weight in the company. I believe he fired their advertising department and then brought other people in and kept a few of them around to go into marketing and do that sort of thing. But he really shook the company up in the early years. And in the meantime, you had, on the other side, you had Christopher Davidge doing everything he could to undercut them. And then you had Dee Dee Brooks, who came in, who was a real go-getter, very aggressive, and she was from a very fancy family from the Connecticut area. She went to Miss Brooks School. She went to Yale. Their family had summers in Long Island and the Hamptons, out in that area. They were in the social register. So she was on the sort of the upper crust of the American side of the equation. So you had Mr. Tubman, the mall developer, the shopping mall developer, who was interested in buying art, who bought Sotheby's. Then you have Dee Dee Brooks, who is the sort of go-getter prep school queen, who was appointed and moved up through the company. She was very smart, very aggressive, a little too aggressive at times. And then you had Sir Anthony Tennant, the British aristocrat, the head of Christie's, and you had Christopher Davidge on his front end, serving as managing director, who did sort of day-to-day operations. And eventually, the Dee Dee Brooks and Christopher Davidge sat down and made a deal. And that's where it really started to go bad, which was in 1995. And what Christopher Davidge turned over were papers containing the details of communications that he kept all the records. He kept every communication, every note, every message that was sent, records of phone calls and so forth, between the most senior executives of both Sotheby's and Christie's to decide how they could stop undercutting each other and stabilize commissions. And this was a big issue at the time. And so on that list of names, you, of course, had Mr. Davidge, and you had Anthony Tennant, the Sotheby's chairman, and Dee Dee Brooks and Alfred Tubman, and a few others, but they were the primary handlers of this mess. And the two sides has talks, it was alleged at the time, of secret meetings, surreptitious telephone calls to arrange their sort of new scales of sale commissions in 1995. And they were said that they fixed the buyer's premium. They refused to allow any more negotiations on seller commissions and that sort of things. And once that was done, both sides adopted both companies adopted the same commission schedules within a few months of each other. And if this could be proven in court, these hidden contracts would constitute illegal conspiracy to restraint of trade. And this is a Sherman Act violation, and it's up to $10 million in fines for the company and $350,000 for individuals, and prison terms of up to 3 years or both. So it was a fairly serious matter. And what saved Christie's was, much to the horror of Sir Anthony, was that by doing this, Christopher Davidge, by going first and turning in the paperwork and getting the ball rolling on their side, it actually saved their skins. And of course, the United States can't extradite anybody from England for this kind of financial crime. So Sir Anthony was off the hook, and Christopher Davidge was given complete immunity from prosecution. Sir Anthony, rather, didn't have such an agreement. He was not eligible for any sort of a special deal if he came to the United States, but Mr. Tennant would remain immune as long as he stayed in England, in which he did until the day he died. But the point of it is that Sir Anthony was off the hook. Christopher Davidge was off the hook. He got his severance package of $10 million from Mr. Pinault before sending in the paperwork, and he left for India. He went to India to sort of hang out for a while the dust was settling. He did come back to testify at the trial. All right, but it was a very, very messy situation. Mr. Tubman proclaimed his innocence up and down, even though it was proven in court that he was in it right up to his eyeballs. Christie's was viewed as having ratted on them because they went to the prosecutors first. And of course, it's the advantage that they would have done. What's interesting is that Dee Dee Brooks, and leaks suggest that she also approached the Justice Department. Once she knew that Christopher Davidge had a deal, she approached the Justice Department offering to turn over everything, do anything they wanted to the Department of Justice if they would let her off the hook and just go after Tubman. And she missed out by a week, according to the Justice Department. If she'd gone earlier, they would have given her the deal. But they didn't, and by the time she did, it was too late to do anything about it. And the immunity, according to people involved with the case, was very wide-ranging for Mr. Davidge, and insulated Christie's quite a bit from some of the legal repercussions, because there was a possibility that they could be prevented from doing business in the United States again as a foreign company. They could have had all kinds of sanctions thrown on them, and this is the thing I think that really disturbed Christie's the most at the time. All right. So, but they didn't do that. And when the news broke, Brooks and Tubman both resigned their positions right away from Sotheby's, and they were instantly replaced with some new people. And it went on from there. In the end, Christopher Davidge lived to be 85 years old. He died in 2014. He never went to jail. He never got in any trouble. He was fine. Alfred Tubman, the owner of, he's a billionaire and owner of Sotheby's for a number of years, he died in 2014, and he was sentenced to a year and a day in jail. He paid $7.5 million in fines, plus he threw in $150 million of his own money to settle the class action suits against Sotheby's as part of the deal, because the final settlements were up around $557 million. Dee Dee Brooks pled guilty in a plea deal of her own. She finally got one. She did testify, and the judge went pretty lenient on her. She got 1,000 hours of community service, 3 years of probation. She was on an ankle monitor for, I think, a year or two, and she had to pay a $350,000 fine, except, I think she was confined to home arrest except for going to church and doing her community service. She knew she was in a lot of trouble, because at the time that all these charges came out, she and her husband, who was a Wall Street investment banker type, they sold their house in Greenwich, Connecticut, and put all the money into a house in Florida, which has very strong homesteading laws. So if there's a judgment against her, they at least wouldn't get their home from them. And as I said, Sir Anthony Tennant couldn't be arrested or brought over for prosecution as long as he stayed out of the United States. He never came here again. And of course, it's kind of ironic that all of this price fixing happened because of the competitive actions adopted by Christopher Davidge, who before all this set out to sort of heavily compete against and hopefully bankrupt Sotheby's in getting more consignments than they had. This was what he really wanted, and he sort of started this whole commission war and price war between the two companies. And in the end, when it was going to when they had rigged it and it was starting to hit the fan, he was the one that left town first and turned in all the paperwork that got everybody else convicted, and he didn't suffer any real repercussions from it. He got a lot of nonsense from people, but he lived to be a ripe old age, and he basically walked away with an immunity deal and a pocket full of money. So that was the story. It was a very interesting period to go through. I found it very fascinating. I remember watching the stories in the news. There were all kinds of conflicting reports about what was really going on. But what I've just told you in a nutshell is what happened. And so you had these four very different personalities from four very different backgrounds. All of them had an axe to grind. All of them were particularly greedy, actually. And they all got caught up in it because of their own arrogance. They all thought they were above it. They all thought that they couldn't get in trouble for it. To the day he died, Alfred Tubman doesn't know what they did wrong. He didn't see anything wrong with any of it. And but there's a lot more. There's a whole other series of stories about Mr. Tubman's wife, which is rather fascinating. How she came to marry him, and her social life, and what Mr. Tubman had done, mischief he'd gotten into before buying Sotheby's, and so forth. So it's a very big story. I think they made a movie about it at some point. I'm not sure where it is or what happened to it, but it was a very interesting thing, and it really shook up the social world and the art community for quite a while afterwards. Both companies did a good job at squaring away their images and reputations, and I do think they were, the workers at both firms, didn't know anything about any of this. This was all kept, at the top of the food chain. They're both good companies. I like them both. I've done business with both, but it just shows you how wrong something can go without a lot of effort. So that's the story. Have a great day, and we'll be back tomorrow with the regular video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. No, the regular video is in 2 days, excuse me. But if you haven't subscribed, please do. And thanks so much for watching. All right. Bye-bye.